Thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate you having you on the stage today. Before I jump into our survey, we're going to ask you all what you want to talk about today, which I think was your ideas. So they unscripted said, let you run the show and tell us what you think is the most important topics of the day. I want to point something out. I've been in this space since 2004 in the kind of recruiting technology space and employer brand space before there was an employer brand space. Back in 2005, I remember having arguments on like recruitingblogs.com about whether it was employer brand or employee brand, because consumer branding is branding for the consumer. Employer branding was supposed to be for the employees, not for the employer. And I'm still fighting the challenge. It's not employer branding, it's employee branding, but I've lost. But what I think is most exciting about this panel, and why I'm so excited about this, and why I think there's so much value for everybody here, is that we have three people here who are doing this at a high level in very successful organizations. And none of them came from talent acquisition or from HR backgrounds. So Charlotte came from an internal corporate communications background and came up through that way, not from recruitment, advertising, or talent. Hannah, you came from kind of media, external media communications and marketing into this space, and you came from an analyst background.
Among other things, yes.
So really, these are three people who I feel are sitting in some of the most important seats driving the recruiting culture based on the content we've seen today, who don't actually have backgrounds in recruiting. They have backgrounds in understanding people, understanding how to drive communication and brand and messaging to make sure that they're putting their message out there authentically and in a way that drives candidates that fit. And as Brian was saying earlier, filtering out those that don't fit into the organization. So I just love that none of the background came from internally from HR or from talent, which I think is just really unique. So thank you all again for being here today. I guess the most important thing here is what are quick and resourceful tips to market our employer brand right away? This is like the most direct tip of the spear question. Yeah. How do I do this really well, right? So what are the quick and resourceful tips to market our employer brand immediately? So let's start there. We will jump into one of either B or D if we get to it. We don't have a lot of time, and I want to make sure that you all have time to speak, and everyone came here to learn from you. So who wants to jump in and say, what's the number one way to market your employer brand?
This was Hannah's question, so I think you should take the lead.
I will happily do that. Scrappy is my favorite word, so I'd love to talk about this. Thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, especially with this crew. So I work at a company called Hubspot. We make marketing, sales, and customer success software. We're based in Boston. We have over 3,000 employees in about 9 different offices globally, and I run our employer brand team. So I have 4 direct reports, and we work with every division of the business to help them build brand about why their unique department is a wonderful place to work and grow your career. And we do that globally as well, so in every region where we operate. So as you can imagine, even though we are a fairly large team as far as employer brand standards go, we are stretched pretty thin because we work at an inbound marketing company, right? So every department is hoping to see us do marketing for every single part of their funnel. And we really have to pick and choose and prioritize where we can help and then be really scrappy and enable recruiters and enable hiring managers to be able to be scrappy on their own as well to build brand. So specifically, a couple tips that have really helped us. The first one would be lean on your employees. Employees are your number one marketing resource. They're the best asset that you have. They're the best marketing tool that you have. And some scrappy ways to do that would be, number one for me would be Glassdoor reviews. We put a lot of energy into when I say getting them, I don't mean begging people to leave 5-star reviews. I mean just kindly reminding people that Glassdoor exists so they don't get pissed off at you, specifically your engineers. So Glassdoor reviews are a huge one. Candidates do look at it. It does matter. The other one I would say to be scrappy is if anyone uses Canva or easy to use design tools like that, you can really create beautiful graphics in like 5 minutes or less with no design background for free. So even if you're promoting an open role or helping hiring managers talk about why their team is amazing to work for, Canva is a great tool for free with templates and all of that, where you can start being a marketer kind of pretty quickly. So those are a few that top of mind.
Yeah, I think, so a couple of questions I think have to be answered first, and that's, this is assuming that your employer brand is already developed, right? You have an employer brand, and not just an EVP, which I think some people run off and say, well, we've got an EVP, now we can brand it. All right, well, the other I think assumption here is that, or not assumption, but the question you ask is it internal or do you use an agency? What is your strategy for content development, content sourcing, if it's global, all of those things that factor into it. But I would say if you have all of those things figured out, then the quickest win up front is getting content flowing. Start the machine, get the social engines going. It serves, I think it has gotten so much pressure off of me as a global employer brand leader up front because the activity that it generates externally, which funny enough is where most internal employees start when they look for content about the company rather than the intranet. It starts the positive feedback loop about, hey, did you see such and such was on LinkedIn, or I saw it pop up in my Facebook feed. I didn't even know we could do that. I thought I'd get fired if I posted on Facebook. And then that starts the positive feedback loop for you internally because people are talking about what you're doing externally. So I say go external as fast as possible with good, authentic content.
I echo the content, and one of my scrappy tips in my last role before I joined Danaher, I was at a U.S. healthcare company called Magellan Health, and I had a very small budget. We actually developed that employer brand in 100 days for $100,000, and then I didn't have very much to activate. So I hired 2 interns to join me over the summer, a copywriter and a videographer. And together, each of our employer brand pillars had a storyline, and I asked them to go out and interview. I just got names of suggested folks to interview. They knew what storylines to look for, and they just kept digging to get the why behind the stories. And then the writer wrote the stories for us. They went out on a blog. So starting a Life at Your Company blog, it's a relatively easy, inexpensive thing to do. And we started to publish those. And within 4 months of activating the brand, those blog posts had an average session duration of 3 minutes and 32 seconds, showing just how valuable they were to people. So again, content, interns, doing it yourself, or even getting other folks in your organization to write things for you. And you can do this before your brand is built. So you can just focus on stories about purpose and impact and belonging, like we learned this morning. And then after you have your brand and your pillars, you can really dive in to bring those things to life.
So can you talk a little bit more about how you activated that? So it's one thing to have a blog. How did you get people to it? Were there paid campaigns behind that? Were there internal campaigns of like, hey, this segment of the company, we want you to go and share it on, like it, share it, tell their friends. How did you get that so it was actually marketed out into the external space?
We did 2 things. So we had a programmatic media budget. So we started to drive some passive traffic to those blog posts to match up some of those talent community campaigns. But predominantly, we posted it on social media, and we got the employees and the associates that were starred in it to share. And just last week, we published an article at Danaher. I got one of our leadership development associates to write a story about what the program has been like for him. He got 500 likes in like a day. It was crazy how much engagement came out of it. And it's because it came from him, not from the company. So getting your associates to actually do the posting will get more traction quicker.
Do you both do that? Do you have associates taking responsibility?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes, we do. Building on that a little bit, it's interesting because we have a careers blog at Hubspot all about, it used to be more about the specific roles about working with us and what to expect in that job. And we found that the engagement on them was high, like people that were already very interested. It was a great middle of the funnel tool and they were spending a lot of time there. But the traffic wasn't good. Like the energy that we were putting into long form blog posts wasn't actually worth the number of views that it was getting or the net new followers that it was attracting. And so we experimented. We started to notice that LinkedIn did something a couple years ago with its algorithm. I won't pretend to understand algorithms, but it did something where the short form content in your feed was getting a lot more traction than it ever did before, like thousands and tens of thousands of views and likes and things like that. So while our blog wasn't getting a lot of traction and we were seeing much more energy on LinkedIn, we ran an experiment where we were hiring a lot of salespeople at the time. And so we sat down with 12 of our sales hiring managers globally, and we put them in a 6-week content program. And we gave them each a prompt to write about each week, no longer than 1,300 characters, which is super short. We edited it for them pretty lightly, and they would post it on their own LinkedIns. And they did this once a week each for 6 weeks. And there were 12 of them. After the 6 weeks, their combined views on those was 800,000 views, which was exponentially more than our careers blog was ever going to get. So going back to Charlotte's point, having the actual employees publish it themselves is huge. I mean, the challenge there, and you guys experience this, I'm sure, is just getting people to do it. But definitely we kind of stopped investing in our own channels and just started going to where people were.
Yeah. Just to follow up on, so the cool thing about employer brand is that there's a handful of us, if you think about it, in the space. And so it's a very tight community. So you get to share best practices and what works, or try this, have you tried that? And one of the things that I gratuitously borrowed from Charlotte one day when I was telling her about a campaign we were doing to attract more diverse talent in the tech space was we did an A/B split test. And so the first campaign was going out to Amgen employees that fit all the criteria that LinkedIn allows you to filter down by. But then the second one targeted the internal employees with that same criteria. We ran a sponsored targeted campaign for 2 weeks. Within the first 2 weeks, the non-employee campaign generated like 187,000 impressions. I think it was like 500 something click-throughs. Cool. Engagement rate was phenomenal, but 0 applicants. The employee targeted campaign, 56,000 impressions, 200 clicks, 4 applicants, which proved that the value of the content to the employee, to their network, was way higher than people who were not already in the consideration set. So if you think about, the credibility that your employees already have with their networks, and when they share content, it goes so much further than a blind shot in the dark, right?
And when you're doing your activation and your company has never had this, I always work for really well-known companies no one's ever heard of. So these brands are so excited to see some fanfare and some marketing and some creative campaign work, but we forget to show it to them. And especially if you've got a big virtual workforce, you can target them on LinkedIn and Instagram and actually advertise to your own people. And the engagement and the shares you get from that is just pretty phenomenal. So I'd encourage you guys to do that.
So I have a kind of a follow-up question to the one we have here. In my last organization, we had a team building budget monthly. So our managers took their teams out, and they would normally take pictures of the event. They would go bowling, they would go race cars, they would do whatever, go-karts, whatever it was, and they would post a picture. They would post a picture themselves and say, hey, I had a great time with my team. When we noticed that was happening organically, we then recommended to them to tag the people and get their permission and tag them. And what we saw immediately happen was their parents, their siblings, their friends all of a sudden started commenting on our posts. And it was an organic employer brand campaign that was happening already natively. And it was now being targeted based on maybe shares. It was great to have XYZ company employees, and now their networks it's showing up in their feeds. And then once their families started commenting, like you were saying, the algorithm boosts that post. So all of a sudden it's getting activity, and those stay live longer. And so then we added let's put a link to our job openings in there while we're doing this. Maybe that would be a good idea.
Sneaky.
Yeah. So my question really on this is, how do you look at the two ways of marketing? There's the branding where you're creating content, you are curating content, you're making sure it's well designed, it's specific to your company's values and your important ideals to target the right people, versus the organic side of an employer brand, and how your employees are natively and organically communicating your brand without your permission necessarily, if that makes sense. How do you balance those two pieces, and do you try to control both?
Well, as the resident highly regulated industry representative here with Amgen and biotech, my job, or the struggle in my job, is getting people to actively post anything, right? Because if you work in banking or finance, or if you're in pharma, the wrong wording on a tweet can get the FDA in your mix, and you don't want that. You can get fined as a company, let alone fired. So the activation phase of getting people comfortable with what they can and cannot do first is critical to getting that increase in engagement, number one. Once they see it and they see it modeled, and they see their peers getting more active, and you find those fearless few to start, right? They're socially active already. they have strong networks, they're willing to be your front runners, then people start to look left and right and say, okay, I guess I can do this too. But I always say, start with the people who are, start with the willing, and then the engagement happens. Once you have the machine running and you start seeing people posting more actively, tagging and so forth, we'll just comb the hashtags on the channels and, reach out to them via email saying, hey, do you mind if we, post this on the company page, to a larger audience? And we haven't gotten a no yet.
I think it's a great takeaway, though, for everybody is start with the willing. There are definitely people at your company that love posting on social, right? That do it every day. And I think that's a big challenge I've seen before, trying to convince a department or to convince the company versus starting with the willing and then showing, the proof of what they're doing. So how do you look at those?
Organizations I work for are really competitive, so I like to start and do a small pilot, and then it gets the natural competitive juices going. If you can articulate the return on those campaigns and share it, other leaders, other business units, other divisions start to want to get more engaged. To answer your early question with the organic versus the branding communications, everywhere I worked has been in a different stage with both, so I would just focus on whichever one needs more help first. So I just joined Danaher in April. We have quite a lot of organic activity going on LinkedIn. It's our primary channel. So I just came up with a new hashtag for us so that I can have stuff specific to life at Danaher, and I comb that and repurpose some of those. And that gives me some time to get my brand going. So it's taking me 6 months to develop and activate the brand. So I'll focus on the organic stuff until I've got a really strong framework to articulate and activate.
Yeah, and I think related to the willing or your champions, the important thing with them too is to recognize them and celebrate them. I think it's important to point to those people as people who are helping on the recruitment front, people who are future leaders, celebrate them in team meetings or give them a shout out somehow. I think it makes a big difference. One thing we're looking into doing at Hubspot, but as you can imagine, not too many people are fans of it, is working some sort of content creation to promotion criteria for managers, so that if you're going to be a manager, it means you're going to be hiring and growing a team. You should be responsible for publishing content about why someone should join your team. So kind of things like that and building it into what success looks like for someone and just make it part of the path would be an ideal, but I think just celebrating and recognizing those people to start is a big win.
Yeah.
That's a good point. One of the things that I do to help our Glassdoor ratings is I actually bake it into our intake review. So the recruiter asks the hiring manager to go and tap 3 people on their team to leave an updated review day in the life for those roles. They're going to tap highly engaged associates who are already going to say positive things. If negative reviews do exist, they'll go to the bottom, the new ones get surfaced, and they're motivated to fill those roles. So you're going to get the results quicker.
I think another thing is to consider showing people how to be an active ambassador. One of I think the easiest things you can do is create quick reference guides, right? Profile, how to pimp your profile, as we say. And I focus on LinkedIn a lot because the network strength and activity there from a professional perspective is built in. It's a no-brainer. So we do a talk around the company on the power of personal brand, showing people how to have an active profile where you can attract talent without even basically in your sleep. But then the few things that you can do to to encourage people to reach out and connect based on the value that you're offering to the world. So, giving them examples of, cut and paste copy that they can start with, right? Showing examples of really good performing content that they can mirror or emulate. And then, making it very simple. Work with an agency or your graphics department to make it sexy, so it's not just an email document or a Word, document, but make it branded, right? Really get them into the process and show them what good looks like.
I think it's great. I love the competitive piece. I never really thought about that before. And in that specific case I was referencing before, once a couple managers were doing that, the expectation from the employees was like, hey, are we taking a picture? like because they saw it happening to their coworkers. So then it organically grew because the expectation was there, and it was a competitive view actually. Now, if you're a manager, you have to do a cooler thing, and now you have to post it and share it and make sure that you're doing it quickly because now they want to see it. So it was really interesting. I like that view of the competitive view.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, one of the most successful things that I've seen from a global perspective is ambassador challenges. So I know Latin America, when I was at Merck, former company, the Latin American team had people opt in to be ambassadors, right? So they'd have to go through a training, understand what's expected, what they can, what they can't do, and then set up the framework. And every week there were challenges to see whose posts perform the best, right? Most likes, most shares, most engagement. And we did all this initially by spreadsheet tracking, which I don't recommend. And then once we launched LinkedIn Elevate, I mean, that was easy, right? You can easily rank performance by location and so forth. But that kicked out more organic content than we'd ever had in the past year prior. And the competitive nature, they were competing for gift cards, spotlights, internal recognition, and so forth.
I actually won an iPad at a previous company by sharing and posting out more jobs than everybody else, right? So it was just like, oh, for an iPad? Sure, I'll do that. And I also love the idea of management. I'm going to steal that one, Hannah. Like the idea that managers are brand ambassadors for your company very, very really, so they have to be good at it. I've never thought about that before. I'm absolutely going to steal that. Before we go on to another topic, I have one quick question about this, which is how do you define quick? When people say, what are quick and resourceful ways? What is quick? What should somebody out here think about? Can they go out tomorrow and do this? And is it measurable? Or how should we be thinking about the timeline of what is quick to get your employer brand out?
Good question. It's probably different for all of us. So depending on your company size, your team size, and all those sorts of things, so it's probably very different. But I define quick and scrappy to my team as something you can do without anybody else's help, resource, budget, and you could do it and test it between now and the end of the week. So that's very specific. That's how we think about it. Get an MVP of something up, and if it seems like it'll be successful, invest more. But if you can do it in a week, great.
I love that. Ditto.
Yeah, and I think quick for me is defined by how quickly I can get compliance, regulatory, and legal on board with what I'm going to do, right? And so to sort of pull all of that out of the equation, we created guardrails and guidelines of things that we would absolutely never say or talk about. So that way we didn't have to go back and get approval for every tweet, Facebook post, Instagram post, and so forth. So they felt comfortable with the guardrails, and then we were able to go, I mean, at this point, we can post real time to any channel without question. So if you set yourself up for successful in terms of compliance and approval up front, then you can go as quickly as you see fit.
Great tip. Do more work up front to save yourself time later. All right, so we're going to move on to another topic here, but there was a tie between feeling the tension and better together. So how do I leverage the partnership with marketing versus how can I tactfully navigate the politics between HR and marketing? They're kind of the same question.
Which one has more energy right now?
Yeah.
Politics or
Collaboration.
better together?
Yeah, right.
Collaboration.
All right, better together.
The kumbaya, okay.
All right. So how do I leverage the partnership with marketing to strengthen our employer branding? You know, we've talked about it before, the role of branding or branding representative or marketing representatives did not exist in talent acquisition 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So a lot of companies, I would say 95% of the companies I talk to still don't have it, right? The tips of the spear, the best of the best have it. They still don't have it. So everybody else is relying on a partnership. So how do they bridge that gap? How do they work together?
I think I'll jump in first here because I have navigated this particular challenge. I'm on my 6th employer brand build at a Fortune 500 company, and the same politics have arisen in every single role that I've taken. And it's always between HR and marketing. And what I've learned is that the first 6 months of a role, when it's newly created, it's the first time your organization is investing in it. And often it's the first time you as an employer brand person are working in this capacity. It's a lot of change management. And when you don't have the power, if you report into HR and you have to influence and get marketing's buy-in and support, you often have to give that away. And I'll tell you a story, a very painful giveaway that I did at my last role that actually changed everything. And it was the 11th hour. We were trying to get some creative approved. And my CMO said, absolutely not. I'm not letting this go out. I don't like the shape of these triangles. And every single time she reviewed something, I'm not kidding you, it was some other nitpicky thing. And it was just quite clear that it was never going to get approved if an outside agency was doing the work. She really wanted, I read between the lines and thought that she really wanted to have some ownership over it. She had just joined a few months before I did, so she wasn't emotionally attached to the initial creative, which is another challenge I've run into. But she wanted some ownership. So at the last minute, I said, you know what, Julie, I don't think we're going to be able to get this over the line. Would you mind if I got the working files and gave it to your designers? And could you show me what good would look like for you? And she changed it and she did stuff to it that like I was crying about, thinking this is terrible. But you know what? I let it go. I let it go. I didn't quit. And within a couple months after activating that brand, because there was so much support, it actually got adopted as our overarching corporate brand at a Fortune 500 company. And it's the first that I'm ever aware of the employer brand becoming the brand. Mm-hmm. And we had created such a flexible framework when we articulated it that it spoke to not only candidates, but also associates and investors and members of our healthcare plan with equal strength. So there was a lot of room for it to grow. So I gave the power away, as painful as it was, but then I got so much more in return.
It's fantastic.
It's an awesome approach. I think to veggie back on that one as a vegan, I won't piggyback on it. I'll simply say you have to figure out ways. Well, let me ask a question first. Does anybody here share a LinkedIn channel between HR and marketing? By show of hands, hold them high. So then you'll know that the employer brand content always outperforms the corporate content, right? People like people more than company announcements. It just is what it is. So there's an inherent level of jealousy sometimes, right? And not of you, but the fact that your numbers outperform theirs. Even though it's a shared channel, it's a combined win. Is how it should be looked at. So what I found is extremely helpful is figure out ways to help them make their content better. Instead of trying to fight for time or calendar space, let's figure out how we can take a story that we're doing and maybe it works better for you. Or a story that you want to do and maybe you can borrow some elements. Let's have some conversations. Let's figure out how we can have a shared win on the channel, because at the end of the day, people on the other side of that screen don't know who put that post out. It's only internal. And that's when you reground the conversation like that and keep it in mind that the people who matter most are the consumers of the content, not the creators of it, right? And work backwards from your audience.
It's a really good point. I'll often sit with my marketing and corp comms teams and we'll align our content calendars, and I'll look at the things that they're trying to promote and see if I can craft or use my resources to create a story that works for our hiring and attraction goals, but also fulfills theirs. So say they want to focus on innovation as a content theme for that month. I'll pull associates in maybe an R&D group that we've got an attraction campaign going, and I'll write stories that feature innovation and our associates, and I'll hand it over for them to use for their campaigns. And when they start to see that reciprocity and that sharing, and you've got resources that they don't have to tell the story differently, they start to like working with you a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that piece about combining the content calendars and figuring out your similar themes and where the overlap is really powerful. And in addition to that, if you're asking for resources, and I think this is something I kind of wish I thought about years ago and might seem obvious now, but I think it was starting very much from a place of, I need this and you're supposed to give it to me because, I just deserve it and hiring's important. As you can imagine, that did not go well.
That's not true.
Yeah. So that did not always go well. We've got to a much better point now with our marketing team at HubSpot, where it is much more collaborative. And part of that is because, yes, we combine content calendars and we think about like our common goals and where the overlap is. But it's also because we start out the year together, like, here are the 5 things that are going to happen in 2020 for employer brand that are really important that I want you to just know now. And how can we make sure that you're also building around those and supporting us so that it's a joint effort? I think starting from here's what you can expect from us, here's where we would need some buy-in and resources way up front is really helpful. Whereas it used to be a little bit more reactive, and it's easy to think like, oh, you have creative, so you should help us with creative. I think planning in advance and recognizing that they have big priorities too has been helpful.
That sounds obvious, but I don't think it is. I think most people start where you started. Like, you have all the stuff, I need it, help me. So do you all have creatives on your staff underneath your umbrellas, or are you using creative from marketing?
I happily use the creative of my recruitment marketing agency, Shaker. I wasn't paid to say that.
I also use external agency resource, and it's been different at different organizations I've been part of. But I will say, being in HR and trying to get internal creative support, I always fell to the bottom of the pile in terms of priority. So I would wait a really long time, and the internal chargebacks were not cheap either. So I often found it easier to just have some creative retainer hours, so that I could send stuff over to agencies. And I've worked with a lot of different agencies over the year, but I do find better creatives typically are at agencies and internal. The folks that work internally at the organizations, they're good at the production work, but when you're doing new conceptual work and you want some really strong creative, I find that stronger on the agency side.
I want to say internal, but it's not with internal creative professionals. I push my team to get really good at creative. We're by no means professional designers or videographers, but luckily our brand standards do not have to be, anything sophisticated or very professional. We're incredibly scrappy. So I encourage my team to use Facebook Live video, shoot video on their phones, use Canva for everything that we design. So we do all the creative ourselves. It's not always pretty, but we give each other feedback on it and just try to learn from it.
All right. So we do have a few minutes left. I did want to give the audience some time to ask questions because, I think you have an amazing panel up here of people who have done it a number of times over and come from a very different background than a lot of the people getting into this world. So we'd love to give you all the opportunity to ask any questions. Are there any questions out there?
Yeah, it's largely going to depend on the digital maturity of your legal team, right? But you can. I have not seen it where there's not at least one in there, right? That can help be sort of the Trojan horse for the rest of the team and getting buy-in. But what I say, your data privacy person should be like your right hand, because what it comes down to is consent, right? Especially in the UK, Europe, and so forth with GDPR, whole different jurisdiction and rules, but. In the States, I'll say we got buy-in from our data privacy people that set legal, at ease to basically get 3 different types of consent, right? Instead of just having the consent form traditionally, which is a pain in everybody's ever-loving hind parts, we were able to get approval to do verbal consent in the presence of witnesses. Hey, is everybody cool with me taking this picture? Everybody cool with it going on social? Yes. Witness? Good. The other one was email. If I, got the shot and not everybody consented at the time, I'll shoot the email to the people in the picture. Are you okay with this going out on social? They respond in the affirmative. That's documentation. And then finally, the written form. But legal was brought along when data privacy said, no, we're good. And then, that's when you also start to, spotlight them as thought leaders. How can I get your take and put you out front as a subject matter expert in the legal space? And maybe do a profile spot on you or whatever. Make them a part of the movie, not just an audience member, right? Yeah.
Only thing I would add is Facebook is a tricky one, and I read some research recently, and it focuses more on university recruitment. But students in general don't want to learn about your employer brand on Facebook, on Instagram. They're really uncomfortable interacting. They want to use it for their own personal enjoyment, but they don't want to interact with your brand in that way. So we focus, but the only exception is LinkedIn. They want to be on LinkedIn and they want to interact with you. So I focus my associates to start on LinkedIn and to have the conversations there. And when it's coming from their channel rather than yours, I don't think you need all those consents because your brand isn't liable for what an associate is putting on their personal channel. Mm-hmm. So you can have some more quick, scrappy success focusing there first.
Yeah. And you can't police the internet.
Right.
So if you remind people of that, right, their personal profiles are their personal profiles. Mm-hmm. It's only when they start mentioning the company that, your social media policy kicks in. And I think that's another thing that legal, needs to be reminded of sometimes is that we have this figured out in the social policy. Just make sure that it's being referenced consistently, right, and that people have taken the trainings and so forth. But you can't police the internet. It's impossible.
All right. I would love to ask you all for just one parting thought, the biggest thing that you've learned across your career for people who are just getting into the game. What's the one thing you'd say, make sure you take this away?
My biggest lesson learned is that most of us spend way too much time, way too much money, and we end up activating a value proposition that's only 50% complete. So if you heard Brian speak this morning, what I started to learn in my last role was really the power of combining that mutual value exchange, where you're embracing some of the things that your associates need to be prepared for and incorporating that into your messaging. When we worked together at Magellan Health and activated that brand, within that 4-month metric, we had a 42% increase in qualified applicants just from changing the narrative to being strength-based versus that mutual value exchange. And I think most of us spend too much time and too much money. So by the time we go to market, it's not even relevant anymore. The market changes so quickly that if it takes 12 to 18 months to put something out there, all of the insights you gathered are dated. So I would encourage you to move at pace.
Yeah.
My one parting advice, going back to the scrappy question, would definitely be just DIY. So at least for us, being able to do everything yourself and own the process yourself, it seems daunting. And I work with our HR team a lot, and they're like, I couldn't possibly write something. I couldn't possibly, publish something on social. I think people overthink it a lot. We're all marketers. It's not hard to write a couple sentences or a paragraph about your workplace. So I would say DIY is my parting advice.
Great.
Yeah, I think in the context of HR and marketing, or your global communications or corporate affairs, whichever the title is, the thing I would say is pick better battles. There's things that you might, it's easy to fall into the us versus them, right? Which then grinds things to a halt. And at the end of the day, the entity that speaks for the company as a company, not as an employer, typically wins. So figure out what things you can, what trade-offs you can make, what things you could give up in the short term that really aren't that big of a loss, to get some equity, right, and some currency or capital with your counterparts.
Excellent. Charlotte, Hannah, John, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your presence. Thanks, everybody.